Welcome to the second semester. This is the first unit, British Romanticism, and it's going to take us through the next several weeks of the course where we lay out a brand new foundation of where the literature is going to go, what its influences are, and really how it represents change from what we did in the first semester to this new term. So basically, the Romantic period was largely a reaction against the ideology of the Enlightenment that dominated much of European philosophy, politics, and art from the mid-17th century until the close of the 18th century. Basic definition, you want to make sure you have that immediately in your notes. Now, if we know that British Romanticism was this new radical movement that really dominated and changed what was going on in the Enlightenment, I think there's a lot of things going on. We know that the movement rejected the ordered rationality of the Enlightenment as mechanical, impersonal, and artificial. We know that the Romantics turned to the emotional directness of personal experience. So that means that the Romantics believed that in order for us to understand the world around us, we had to directly engage in it. So the poetry is going to be deeply personal. The narrative pieces, the imagery, the connotative meaning is all going to be symbolic and allegorical, and we're going to have to spend some time doing some analysis of what those ideas mean. We know that it's critical to the boundlessness of the individual imagination and aspiration. So this boundlessness is critical to our understanding of how all this works. So we want to keep all of that in mind as we look at this particular movement. Now, I want to take a brief moment here to look at how these Romantic ideas manifested themselves in literature. So we know that they did it in several important ways. So it is important to keep in mind that nothing describes all Romantic literature in one nutshell kind of way. So there's going to be differences among each group. There's some general ideas here, however, that provide a reasonable description of the tendencies which would have been fairly commonplace amongst these authors. So first of all, every one of these Romantics believed that art was a product of the individual imagination. Now this is painting, this is sculpture, this is poetry, this is long stories, those kinds of things, that all art is highly prized, it's highly creative, and it's highly individual. Many Romantics found admirers to read their hero worship, and they hero worship the artist as a genius or a prophet. So through the artist, we get closer to some sort of universal human truth. The second of these sort of approaches is that nature and rural life, specifically pastoral imagery, were common subjects for poetry. Here you're going to have to look up what pastoral imagery is. The literary pastoral is a specific term. Just like when we talk about Wordsworth and Coleridge, we're going to use the term literary ballads, and that's going to have a very specific meaning with those authors. We know that, as a third point, individual achievements are highly prized in Romanticism. This notion applies both to actual people, artists, writers, heroes, explorers, etc., and also to the fictional characters that we're going to be talking about. This tendency to have a high price on individual achievements promotes the notion of the Romantic hero, or what we're going to call the Byronic hero. So again, in your notes, I want you to look up the definition of a Byronic hero, B-Y-R-O-N-I-C, and be aware of how that's going to function. A fourth point is that many Romantic writers, especially the poets, believe that all people, regardless of wealth or social class, are able to appreciate art and literature, and that the artist, the poet, the painter needs to make their work accessible to everybody. Now, I want to repeat something there, that all people, regardless of wealth or social class. So Romanticism is an interesting bridge here. It's kind of a break from the heavy focus on social class that we saw in A Modest Proposal, or we saw in Pope's mock epic at the Rape of the Lock. And it's also a break from what we're going to see in the very class-oriented Victorianism, which is coming up several weeks from now. So Romanticism bridged that gap between the haves and the have-nots and tried to get at universal human ideas. So I think these are some things that you need to have in your notes for a good context of what we're trying to do. I think we can get a side-by-side comparison of why Romanticism is so incredibly different and diverse than the periods that came before. We are very used to the carefully organized arguments, the empirical data of a Jonathan Swift, who wrote A Modest Proposal saying, here's a logical reason why. We are very aware of that evaluation of social constructs, what's wrong with society, the mock epic that we saw with Alexander Pope, laying out why we don't like the elements of society as they exist. So I think those things matter. When you look at the emotion of Romanticism, this right-hand column, the arguments are driven by feeling. So you're making a connotative analysis of why these things are going to matter. We study the emotional impressions, so it's not the face value. It's how you're supposed to feel after you read about A Red, Red Rose by Robert Burns, or To a Lamb by William Blake, or even something as significant and moving as Kubla Khan by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, that our initial and then the developed emotional impression of the work is critical for us in our understanding. We know that this is very much a forest for the trees argument. Now, this is simple. This means to me that while we can break down all the images and we can take all the notes on specific ideas, we're talking about the bigger picture. What do we see as the general impression? The poem may be 12 lines. It may be 120 lines. But there's still that boiled down singular idea that we need to get at. So we know that the literature, the poetry is going to focus on a singular human experience. So how I feel walking a few miles above Tintern Abbey, what it feels like when rejected by a love, what it feels like when experiencing a ghost for the first time. These are all very specific ideas that I think are going to be critical to our understanding of how the literature is going to work for us. And if you went back to what I said about art, nature, the individual achievements, and what many Romantic writers believed about wealth and social class, you sort of now have a direction to interpret the poetry. So when you get to the later part of this presentation, and I give you some not PowerPoints, but some videos where it talks about other pieces of poetry, you're now starting to put the pieces together. Now, as you have taken these notes, I'm going to transition you over to looking at a specific author. Now, the British Romantics typically start with William Blake, move into William Wordsworth, looking at Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and then from there moving into the revolutionary poets of Byron, Keats, and Shelley. But there's this transitional author from really what we did in the first semester over into this term, and that's Robert Burns. He's a Scot, and what I'm doing now is I'm going to transition you onto a PowerPoint page that reflects some hyperlinks. Now, take those hyperlinks, watch the video. My expectation is that you'll have these when you come into class the next day, and you'll have some notes on why Burns is significant. So make sure you take those, you keep them in your folder, which you review all the time, and then we can move on from there. So with that, happy viewing. The final slide, the final piece of the puzzle for your homework this evening. So after you've gone through all these notes and you've written everything down, I'm dropping you in the deep end with this first poet. So you're going to take a look at Robert Burns. And so there's a couple of ways to do this. Simply click on both of the labels, click here, and they're going to take you to some videos that supply you with some supplemental information. I think really interesting things. So make sure that you review both of these and have them ready for class. If the link doesn't work in the video, then go to Moodle and you'll find both of these labels. I'm going to hold you accountable for the information. Some is background, some is information on particular poems. And this is going to bring this particular presentation to an end. So no official fancy end to the slide presentation, but very clear directions as to what your homework is going to be. Taking notes, watching the video, coming in prepared for class the next day. If you can do these things, I think all will be well. So best wishes and good luck.